In the glossolalia of contemporary Sudanese suffering, Madut is that discerning decoder. As I reviewed his written work for today, his published books and public addresses, interventions and advocacies all, I was struck by how much care, how much patience he had with a world that knows very well the domestic violence of hip-hop starlets, but doesn't know who the Dinka women are or why they experience such amputating violence. From the Islamization of society to the Ottoman impact, from the World Council of Churches to the Ummah Party, Yok offers sympathizing clarity. He sees while others shrug. He is, too, a man of less ephemeral accomplishment. Born and raised in Sudan, a student in Egypt and the United States, Yok did graduate work on the anthropology of health and holds a Ph.D. from UCLA. He's currently a fellow of at the Rift Valley Institute and an associate professor in the Department of History at Loyola Marymount University in California. Meanwhile, he has worked in aid and development, first as a humanitarian and aid worker, and later as a consultant for a number of aid agencies. In addition to his multiple articles, his latest book, Sudan, Race, Religion, and Violence, was published in 2007. This is to speak with tedious formality about a curriculum vitae that cannot translate into the consequences of Yok's field mastery. Into the horror of genocide, he presents the buffering, salving possibility of knowledge production and dissemination that complicates and clarifies history, culture, religion, and race in a region that seems to recede too easily whenever it is near in our intellectual grasp. To it all, to the indifference and the confusion, Yok offers nothing less than hope. Please join me as we welcome Yok to Princeton University.
Thanks a lot. That's a very generous introduction. I am so delighted to be here, not with the weather, but to see so many faces this afternoon who have shown interest in these delicate issues that we try to tackle. What I will do today is provide a brief background, just so that we are on the same page about Sudan. And then I'll go forward to explain the issue at hand today, the intersection of politics and religion, and then try to give voices to some of the people who live this context, and conclude with what I see happening for Sudan, as well as for the region, Sudan being a country that is surrounded by so many countries and has reverberations for those countries. So Sudan is not only the largest country in Africa, it is also the most diverse, with 175 different linguistic groups and different nationalities and religions. It is also a microcosm of Africa, really. Has various religions. It has, even in climate, part of it desert, part of it tropical. It is the only country with more nations around it than any other on the continent. All that background presented this country with serious challenges when independence from Britain came in 1956. Difficulties in achieving national unity, particularly, because that was the language of the day, how to turn colonial countries into nation states where stability reigns. But Sudan, like few other countries on the African continent, confronted more difficulties in achieving that noble ideal. It also confronted problems with delivering services to such a vast country, to such remote and scattered people. The response of the ruling class to these challenges have deepened these difficulties and deepened the disunity of the country rather than bring about unity. For example, North-South polarization had been evident all through the colonial years. Independence was viewed in southern Sudan, for example, as the end of European colonialism and the beginning of Islamic colonialism, giving genesis to the first round of civil war that would continue for 17 years, during which 1.8 million people died. Religion had taken the center stage in the contest for Sudan's national identity and contest of the cultural identity of the country. The further responses by the ruling class, the ruling center, to this was to embark on 3 more actions aimed at a final solution to what had now increasingly become known as the Southern problem. The 3 actions taken by the ruling center to try to deal with these challenges. The first was a strong drive to homogenize the nation. First, in religious terms, i.e. sending religious Islamic clergymen all over the country, especially to southern Sudan and other peripheral regions, and subsequently racially. But the issue of race, we can address it separately later if people are interested. That once the country had become an Islamic state, the argument went in the attempt to homogenize it culturally and religiously. Once it had become Islamic, the ruling class thought that it would easily become Arab, because the tradition and the practice in Sudan is that if you are Muslim, if you are a very devoted Muslim, you are only a few steps away from being an Arab. The second drive, the second attempt to resolve the issue of national unity was to muzzle the voices of opposition. The state became extremely brutal in dealing with its critics, especially the government of the second military coup in the country, 1969, led by somebody called Nimeri, and he would rule for 16 years. This muzzling of voices, of dissenting voices, was practiced in the 70s from the point of view of being a Marxist regime. Sudan was ruled by a party called Sudan Socialist Union, receiving more aid from the Soviet Union than any other country on the continent at the time, before Nimeri switched sides in 1980 and became the strongest ally of the United States on the continent except for Egypt, and became the 3rd largest U.S. aid recipient in the world after Israel and Egypt. Now, the third and most important and most central to our discussion today is the rise of militant Islam. Militant Islam grew out of a few intellectuals in Sudan who became members of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, led by Hassan al-Turabi. The second wave of militant Islam came when Nimeri himself, having switched from being right communist to being right-leaning capitalist, now became an imam, a Muslim clergy, and applied Islamic law, 1983. This application of the Islamic law gave rise to extremism in the way the Christian church was converting people in the South. Churches could no longer carry the large number of people who were flocking to the church. Extremism on the Islamic side gave birth to extremism on the Christian side. Up to this point in southern Sudan, religion was never part of how you contested the nation. Religion in Sudan, in southern Sudan, the the idea of religion is one with the idea of your ethnicity. Your religion is what you are born into, and you don't proselytize. Because if you are born into a Dinka clan like myself, I can only be a member of that clan, and nothing else anybody can do to change that. So religion was never a cause of political turmoil in Southern Sudan. But when the Islamic government of Numeri introduced this Sharia law, it meant that a lot of people flocked to Christianity because that was the only way you can be saved from being prosecuted with the Islamic law. Out of this came the second round of the civil war in 1983. As soon as the Islamic laws were applied, the number of people joining the newly founded opposition army called Sudan People's Liberation Army increased, and all these school kids joined SPLM and SPLA in droves, and the second round of the war began, which will last for 22 years. Dissent in other peripheries of the country was responded to by Numeri's government with such militarized activity that it could only do one thing. It only pushed more people into opposition. Young people flocked to the opposition simply to escape persecution because the entire regions of the periphery, the south, the west, were now automatically stigmatized as this fifth column. They were already accused of being supporters of the opposition. So they joined the SPLA even when they were not convinced about the cause of the SPLA. They simply had to go in order to escape the other side. Violence became the method of choice for the government, method for dealing with these intractable national problems. And this led to a growing subculture of violence becoming rooted in all Sudanese communities, because you see, violence gets, state violence, even though it is at the level of opposition, it also trickles down to the level of community over time as more and more young people become conditioned to violence over a protracted period of conflict, especially in the peripheral areas where war and civil strife had become so endemic for the better part of the last 50 years, really. Because since the country became independent in 1956, to this day, it's only 10 years in the middle when there was a hiatus, and the last 4 years since the signing of the peace agreement. But that is only in reference to North-South conflict. We're not even going to be able to talk about Darfur, the western region of the country. Now, this trickling down of violence from the state system to the community level to family level is a result of long process of conditioning of young people to violence, where especially young men have been robbed of their opportunity to remain children, but chose the taking up arms as the only way to defend themselves. And the consequence is that violence gets reproduced in families, in communities, as young men are under the pressure of continuing to fight to be on the front, but when getting opportunities to go back to their families, they and the women are under the pressure to reproduce, to keep up the reproductive front, to make up for the lost ones in war. So violence becomes an everyday experience for everybody. This is where the intersection occurs between the politics of state building, the politics of national identity, and religion. The war is pitched by all parties to it as a religious war. The state invokes jihad in its attempt to recruit young people to fight the insurgency. You have to justify it to the young men and young women now that this is a question of maintaining the Islamic identity of the country. And the insurgents are out to defame the good name of a Muslim nation. And this is jihad. This is holy war. And it has to be defended. The nation has to be defended. And the accusations follows that the insurgents in the south and now in Darfur are getting their help from Zionist Israel and from the United States. What better enemy to have as a Muslim man? And so more people are enticed into this war by this constant language of accusing the international community. And it is a good way for the government to deflect attention away from itself and blaming the rest of the world for the woes of the country. The recruits are imbued with a militarist culture that uses Islamic ideas in dealing with the civilians in war zone. For example, young Muslim men who have just joined the Sudanese army and been trained for 3 months how to operate machinery but not with military discipline are deployed in areas where they are given a stark divide between how to treat Muslim women and how to treat infidel women, which is the term used to refer to non-Muslims. Another word they use to refer to non-Muslims who may be Christian is Nasara, the people of the cross, which it's a diversion from the way other Muslims around the world have referred to Christians. The Christians have been referred to in Quran and in Islamic language as people of the book. But in Sudan they call them people of the cross, in order to free oneself from the constraints that Islam, your religion, puts on you when you are dealing with Christians. Because if they are people of the book, you are required to respect them. But if they are people of the cross, which is a new term, they are fair game. So these recruits, once deployed in areas that are non-Muslim, where there is insurgency, they are free of some Islamic constraints, such as when a man meets a Muslim woman, she is hurma. In Arabic, it means she is out of bounds. You cannot come near her. But this concept was taken out in the military training of Islamic soldiers deployed in war zones of Sudan. The use of tribal militia, for example, is called Popular Defense Forces. Popular Defense Forces are jihadist army. They are not the regular Sudanese army. Why use the militia? Well, they are cheap counterinsurgency soldiers fighting the war by proxy. You don't have to pay them. But more important, if they commit atrocities that the world community might deem as crimes of war or crimes against humanity or even genocide, it is easy for the government to say that these actions are happening in the context of tribal warfare. It's not the government doing it. And these militia are out of control. The government cannot control them. It's been tried and again since 1984, first by Numeri and later on by even a democratically elected government throughout the 1980s, and then by the current government, which is a military Islamic government that came to power through the third military coup of the country in 1989. The use of militias is a way to blame the atrocities of the war all on tribal conflicts rather than on the state. But on the other side is the influx of a plethora of faith-based NGOs, non-governmental organizations, Christian ones in the south and Islamic ones in the north. Some Christian ones operate in the north as well, but under much rigid conditions from the state, and they get taxed very heavily. If you look at the map of southern Sudan and you place NGOs, every single county has 2 or 3 major NGOs, about 45 of them operating in southern Sudan, and most of them are church-based. they have viewed the war as a confrontation between Islam and Christianity. And they have come to the rescue of their brethren in Christianity. The Islamic ones stationed in the north discriminate. They don't offer humanitarian aid to non-Muslims unless you declare yourself Muslim first before you receive. I witnessed the distribution of food aid in 1988 in Khartoum, whereby people had to declare themselves Muslim first, and they have to pray before they receive food aid. What this does, this intersection of Islamic and Christian NGOs, while of course their intentions are clear and they simply want to help, and they do help, and indeed they save lives, the result of their presence in Sudan is that they have polarized the conflict even further, beyond Sudan. So much that the Sudan government simply look at the presence of Christian NGOs in the south and run to the rest of the Muslim world and the Arab world and say we are under attack because all these Christian NGOs, they are actually providing military support to the local opposition. NGOs such as Norwegian Church Aid has been constantly, or Christian Aid, which is British, or Catholic Relief Services, American, World Vision, World Relief, Samaritan Spurs. Do you know of Samaritan Spurs? Have you ever heard of? Samaritan Spurs is American. It's an NGO established by Bill Graham, Franklin Graham, son of Bill Graham. So they all provide a great deal of help, and the people of Southern Sudan are very appreciative as they have taken over the non-existent state, basically. They are the state. They are the ones that provide basic services in healthcare and education because the state is no longer taking responsibility for people living in war zones. In fact, the war has become perfect for the state in that sense. The war frees the state from responsibility of welfare because they simply say we cannot do development work in war zones. And if those people in those regions could just give up their fight, we will come and help them. But so long as they are fighting, there is no development work that can get there. So the NGOs have taken over what the state is supposed to do. The Islamic NGOs and the Christian NGOs have also complicated the situation when it comes to, they've confused the international and diplomatic environment that cannot work out how to help Sudan resolve its problems. Because the assumption is that the South will be supported by the Christian world and the North will be supported by the Islamic world. And reality doesn't matter. What matters is the perceptions. The current Islamic government uses its religious language to galvanize northern support on the basis of the presence of Christian NGOs in the South, that it has now become a question of survival for the North and its Islamic identity. In fact, it galvanized the support of the North. The support base in the North has been rallied by nearly blackmailing people either into supporting the government or keeping silent on its egregious actions. For example, there have been opportune moments throughout the recent past of the country where there could have been uprising against the government, against the regimes. But to the dismay of many, inside and outside, nothing happened. I'll give you a few examples of some of the things that everybody thought this was going to be it. The Sudanese people were going to go out and revolt against this government. In 1983, somebody called Mahmoud Mohamed Taha, who was a leader of a party called Republican Brothers, The Republican Brothers are followers of a tariqah, which is a Sufi order. And they had a slightly different interpretation of Islam. For example, when Islamic law, the Sharia law were implemented in 1983, Mahmoud Mamata was very critical of them on the basis that Islamic State is impossible to be established in Sudan. Because really, to have an Islamic State, you have to have a situation like the state of Medina, where Prophet Muhammad had suggested to the people that until you have everybody's needs satisfied, you cannot expect people to behave. You cannot expect people not to steal if they don't have adequate food. So Muhammad Mamata was saying Sudan is the wrong place completely to apply the Islamic laws, because it's a very poor country, and a lot of people are definitely going to try to make a living by all means, including theft. So Sudan cannot be the place to be. And even more so, Islamic laws in Sudan cannot be applied by Nimeri. Nimeri, a man who had been a socialist and suddenly a capitalist, and now suddenly he's found spiritual renewal in Islam. A man who had been known all throughout since he came to power, and even as he was a young soldier serving in the South during the First War, he had been known to be a drunk. And in fact, he owed some women money because he had taken alcohol on credit in a small town in southern Sudan. And as the president of Sudan, he went back to that town, and the woman tried to demand payment for her alcohol, and made a scene. So Mahmoud Mamata was completely unconvinced that Nimeri is the right person. Even if Sudan was going to become an Islamic state, Nimeri is not the right person to do it. Well, Mahmoud Mamata was executed in public, in a big downtown square, with thousands and thousands of jeering crowd coming, saying, "Death to the enemies of God." And so the execution, so public and so gruesome, would have been thought that it was the trigger point for all those people in northern Sudan, Muslim, who are opposed to the Sharia law, to come out in droves onto the streets and demand the retraction of these laws. But nothing happened. In 1989, 28 most senior Army and Air Force officers were executed when the current government came to power. They were executed on charges of apostasy, just like Mahmoud Mamata. Why is there private grumbling against an Islamic state in Sudan, but there is sizable public opposition? There's no sizable public opposition to the government, seemingly hated by a majority of Sudanese people. What is the reason why people are not revolting? Well, the government blackmails people. If you speak out and you appear anti-Islamic, no Muslim want to appear anti-Islamic in Sudan. So anytime you criticize the Islamic government, they simply say that you're anti-Islamic, and therefore you may have been paid by the Zionists. And nobody wants to appear to be like that, especially for women. And we know that in the previous successive uprisings, women had been very instrumental and central to the uprising. But now in the current government, the government first order of business was to silence and drive women into invisibility politically by demanding that women not longer be employed in any place where they may come in contact with men. What sort of place would there be? So women can no longer work at the gas station. They can no longer work in the restaurant. They can no longer work as maids, and so forth and so on. So those were the only jobs women could have. as education in Sudan has been so lopsided against women all through its history. So women simply take up all the service jobs. Now the current government says no more of that. And you have to wear a veil. So the veil, even though a lot of women take it, a lot of women wear the veil on their own account, thinking that it is required of them as Muslims, as proper Muslims. A lot of women in Sudan wear the veil simply to escape harassment every day. And it was imposed on them as a symbolic gesture for women's invisibility. That women, not only are they banned from working in public places, they are also demanded to wear the veil. So, supporting many Muslims decided that the best way to oppose the Islamic State is not to come out directly and oppose whatever policy the Islamic State has imposed. The best way to do it is to support any non-Muslim movement, such as the SPLA in Southern Sudan. So a large number of northern Muslims joined the SPLA as their only way of voicing their opinion through that. But non-Muslims are in a bind equally. Opposing Islamic laws all over the country could be read as insensitivity to Islamic sensibilities, to other people's faith. But to demand exemption of the South or other non-Muslim regions of the country from the Islamic laws is to create two nations, two constitutions, because you cannot have one country where it's not a federal state, but you have several constitutions based on their faith. That means unity no more. That means Sudan as a unified state is a fallacy. It's not going to happen. Most especially because of the memory that people currently hold about the war. I want to tell you a story of how one woman remembered the war that has just ended, which speaks to the impossibility of ever having one united country. This woman was captured in Wau by a commander of the government garrison town in Wau during the war. She was dragged to the barracks and she was being interrogated to get intelligence about the opposition army from her. But as the longer the interrogation went, she told me that she wondered whether, in fact, the officer really thought that there was some information I could give her, or whether he was trying to have sex with me. And realizing that the latter was the case, she called somebody in town, another woman, and that woman came, and that woman had been working all along to rescue people who were captured in this manner. And the way she rescued them was to offer herself for sex to the officer. She had done this a few other times to say, this is a mother, she's older than I, she's somebody's wife. I mean, how is she going to live with herself, even if you let her go after you've had forced yourself on her? So the best thing that I can do is to let her go, and I can sleep with you. She had done this many times before. So the woman was telling me that this woman has saved my life. She had saved many other lives like this before. That's one story. Another story I heard in the course of doing interviews for the book on slavery was a woman who was abducted in a slave raid, and she was taken to Darfur. Darfur is also sort of racially divided, as you keep hearing nowadays about Arab and non-Arabs in Darfur. The people who had been in the Popular Defense Force, the militia that had been recruited by the government, the militia is is not only logistically convenient for the government to fight war by proxy, it is also a way to silence some Arabs living in Darfur by giving them a free rein to go and abduct and carry off girls and women to northern Sudan and use them as concubines for the army, or to give them off as presents to their relatives and things like this. So this woman was captured and was dragged. She was chained, was put in a truck, and driven across the river that divides between north and south. And when she arrived on the other side of the river, before she arrived, her child was thrown off the truck. She had a little baby, and the baby was crying. And one soldier stepped on the baby, and she was crying, "You're stepping on my baby." And the soldier just yanked the kid out of her hand and threw the baby off the truck. And when she was up in the north, she was given to a relative of this man who had abducted her as a domestic servant. And in the course of her service, she was cooking, she was doing laundry, she was fetching water, she was getting firewood, and she slept in the barn, the cattle kraal. And every single night, the man would sneak out of his house and goes and assault her sexually every night. Eventually, he also had his two sons come with him to do the same, because according to him, he said that he wanted to make sure that his sons are not gay, so they have to train on her. And so the woman was saying, even cows, she's from a Dinka, and we raise cows, even cows know their relatives. And two bulls cannot have the same cow. I had no idea that human beings can do this. It's been heard of that a man can rape a woman, but a man with his two sons raping one woman, it's something I cannot fathom. She had children with this man, with one of them, and she eventually escaped with the children. And she said that these children are my compensation for all the suffering I have, which brings me to the point that I wanted to make about the differences in how people respond to women who have been assaulted this way in non-Muslim areas, and the way people respond to raped women in the Muslim parts of the north, especially now in Darfur. They were taken in, these children, and they said, well, this man had not even paid the dowry, and this man had killed the first child, so these children are ours, and they are compensation for all the suffering, and we will take them in, because their biological paternity doesn't mean anything. What matters is that somebody is going to come forward and become the social father of these children, because it is social fatherhood that is most important, because any moron can be a father. Not everybody can be a parent. Plus, you can know anyway, for sure, that your children are your biological children. So why bother? But in Darfur, when women have been raped, because of the religious ideas there, the question of chastity, the question of honor, they are all hanging on the shoulders of the women, the honor of the entire society. So that if she had been assaulted by strange men, she has dishonored everybody. And the result is that she has to be kicked out or even killed. Not even to speak of the children that have been born this way. And women in the Muslim societies who have been subjected to this are doubly victimized by the actual rape and by their communities that kick them out or kill them. You've seen this even in Iraq, where women who have been raped end up being killed by their brothers or their fathers because they have dishonored the entire family, even though it was not their fault. But that is what happens because of the traditions that think that women are the pinnacle of family's honor. And if they are aggressed, then the honor of the entire society is pinched, and therefore victimizing them twice. Now, we don't have a lot of time to address the nuances and complications of how the North-South conflict differs from the conflict going on currently in Darfur. But if people are interested in this story, we can address some of your concerns about that. But I think I should stop here and allow any questions. Thank you. Yes.
Doctor, I was hoping to go into this a little bit further. A small question regarding the Janjaweed militias. You mentioned earlier just the role of religion in keeping unity inside these militia groups and motivating them. Now, a lot of literature out there about militias during Civil War stresses that it's just the ability to loot and pillage and possibly rape survivors and keep themselves sustained that way that is a driving force behind them. I was wondering if you could go a little bit further as to whether or not Islamism is indispensable to keeping these groups together or motivating their actions.
The Popular Defense Forces, for sure, they are kept together by their religious ideas, that they are a brotherhood, that their whole nation is at risk of being defamed by the infidels, and that it is a duty of a Muslim man to go out and defend the Islamic nation. So religion definitely, Islamic ideas definitely keep them together. Because the recruitment itself, the propaganda for recruiting these people itself is based on such ideas. But Popular Defense Forces are different from another type of militia called Murahilin. The Murahilin in Arabic means nomads. So these are cattle grazing Arab tribes in Western Sudan who have also complained bitterly against about the government's neglect of their region in terms of development. Have complained to the same extent as the non-Arabs in the region, in Darfur. And so the government decided that the best way to quieten both people, the Arabs and non-Arabs, is to arm the Arabs so that they can silence the non-Arabs. And so the Murahilin will go out in raiding, and they've been given the free rein that whatever they loot belongs to them. And they get arms for free. So for one, in an area where arms are so widespread, getting a free Kalashnikov from the government and getting some training and some instruction in the use of it goes a long way. So the Murahilin then get silenced by the state. They no longer complain about their neglect. But by the same token, they are given a chance to go and loot cattle and loot and abduct people. Because the abduction of people becomes, this is a very complicated issue about slavery in Sudan. Because one might wonder, why are you capturing slaves in Western Sudan when there are 4 million people displaced to the north and living in Khartoum? Why couldn't you just take from them to use them as cheap labor? Well, actually, the reason you use slaves is that you don't use them as slaves selling and buying them. You displace them from their areas, you destroy their livelihoods, they get moved to northern Sudan, and they become a reservoir of a very cheap labor. So that they will have no choices but to go and look for work on farms of the people that have abducted them. And then you pay them nothing. You pay them food. And in fact, you don't even pay them. World Food Program, United Nations World Food Program pays them food. And the food is brought to the displaced persons as humanitarian aid. But it gets looted by the Murahilin at night from them. And then tomorrow it's given back to them as payment for their work on the farms. So raiding became a very easy way to milk the aid cow, as it were. I hope that addresses an aspect. Okay. Yes.
You talked about the differences between the North and the South and the tendency toward animosity. Coming up in 2011, there's going to be the Southern referendum on whether or not there's going to be privacy. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you see happening if you see the election going off at all?
Well, the midterm elections, which is supposed to happen this year, has already been postponed. It's pushed. And so and the census last year was a miserable failure. And these were all the sort of confidence-building measures. If you hold the census on time, if you hold the midterm elections on time, there's confidence that the referendum will happen and it will be a fair process and will be monitored by everybody. This now seems to be already gone off track. Nobody believes in the credibility of the census, so nobody knows. People have not been counted. Voter registration is zero because there is not even any attempt for civic education about people's rights to use the ballot box. And so the referendum, whether it will happen or not, depends on how much the countries that sponsored the peace agreement to begin with continue to focus and pressure for the implementation of the peace agreement. Already the eyes of the world have been stolen from the issue by Darfur and by Congo. So the likelihood that the same pressure that the Bush administration has brought to bear is probably going to be lost, except that, of course, Susan Rice is keeping an eye on it, I think, because she was very much involved during the Clinton years in the Sudan issue. And I've heard her speak, actually, stating to the fact that the implementation of this peace agreement is going to be a primary issue on her agenda. Because especially the UN ambassador, the U.S. Ambassador to the UN is now, for the first time, a prominent member of the decision-making board of the State Department. This is not something that has been done before, but Susan Rice is a very prominent decision-making figure in the State Department foreign policy now. So I think she will push for that. But the new government, our new government here, has to put into place measures to ensure that process is not thwarted, because definitely you might go back to war. And already people are making arrangements for, recently you may have heard that the SPLA has been arming a lot. 40% of the oil proceeds going to Southern Sudan is being spent on the army. No wonder there's no development process whatsoever. But of course, the Sudan government is busy arming itself to the teeth and even manufacturing equipment within Sudan itself. So preparations are being made for war. My only redeeming observation is that both of them are also tired of war. And right now, they are in the best position because they can keep a situation of no war, no peace, while the oil money is flowing. And if the situation remains as it is, it's good for the people in power. You now have two oil kleptocracies that collect oil money, and they don't feel any pressure to provide services to the people because there is no strong constituency to push them to do so. And Darfur is continuing to bleed the country.
Sudan being one of the few non-Arab and Islamic states in the region, who's also part of the League of Arab States, do you see any really willingness and goodwill on the part of these states to bring about positive outcomes? I mean, we've heard about all of these meetings that don't really bring out that much result in the region. What's your opinion?
Well, I'm as puzzled as you are about the attitude of the Arab League and this League of Islamic Nations toward the Darfur carnage. None of them has said a word. They may have met in Cairo, and Amr Musa will say a couple of things, but nothing to the fact that the Sudan government should be pressured a little more in order to respond to the crisis in Darfur. And especially that it is being done in the name of the atrocities in Darfur are being done in the name of promoting Arab culture and Islamic culture in Sudan. And it seems absurd that the countries, members of the Arab League, would see that as being the way you become Arab and not bringing peace. And especially when you look at their responses to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Sudan has not reached a stage where Palestine has become a tool that the Arab countries use to their advantage whenever they see it fit. They criticize the Israelis when they want to make peace with the United States. They criticize Israel and the United States when they want to make peace with the Palestinians, and so forth and so on. Sudan has not become a tool to that extent yet, but the Arab League is not willing to use whatever leverage it has on the government of Sudan to end the scourge in Darfur.
So, if I may, what organizations really, the UN, AU, do you see any hope in any of the efforts that are currently?
I mean, any kind of settlement that is going to come in Sudan, eventually it's going to have to come from the Sudanese, in my view. Until the Sudanese have reached a stage where they say they can no longer gain anything by fighting, I don't think any resolution is going to come, especially to Darfur. And I 4 years ago, I made a remark that if the Darfuris are not careful, they might be looking at another 20 years of war, because they have already now factionalized. They have 15 different factions now. And so it is not easy to even start talking peace, because with whom? If they have not agreed on a negotiating platform, it's going to be extremely difficult to bring the Darfuris together. And the government uses that to promote this idea. Oh, it is not me. If you can just get the Darfuris around the table, we will sit. So I don't think there is any. There may be some political will on the side of some European countries and the United States, but the thing is, the United States has already found itself in a situation where it is no longer a model mediator, because on the one hand, it is fighting wars in the Middle East and Islamic world, so already it's not going to be trusted by the government, especially on this issue of the International Criminal Court indicting President Bashir. On the other hand, the Darfuris are also have been led to not negotiate in good faith because of the pronouncements coming out of the West that they might be helped. So they are anticipating some help, which I'm sure will not come to them. And so they don't really seek peace with that genuineness, because they think that they might be helped so that they can win the war.
Many of the people in Darfur that are being killed, they are Muslim, aren't they? But they are Fur tribe as opposed to Arab tribe. Is that correct?
That is correct. Oh. So basically what happens in the Sudanese racial and religious scheme of things is that you are one people if you are co-religionist. If you are members of the same faith, on the surface of it, you could be one people. And Muslims should respect one another and should treat one another nicely. But some Muslims are more Islamic than others. So that if you are Muslim but not Arab, then the issue of race could still be used against you and could be used to entice the warring factions into the war on the side of the government, out of the fear that if we don't fight, the non-Arabs are going to take over the country and the Arabs will be kicked out. This is the language the government uses all the time. So there is that intersection of race and religion as a site where the national identity is being contested.
On the conflict?
I'm not sure. I'm simply going to speculate based on what I've seen in southern Sudan, because I've only been in Chad, where the Darfuri refugees are. I've not been in Darfur itself. In southern Sudan, there had developed this ethos of using reproduction as a contribution to the revolution, especially expecting, even forcing women to increase their availability to reproduce. And the result of it has been both rising rates of fertility, but also infertility, because the response by a woman who is being forced to have a child, yet in conditions where she is not able to care for the children because the other children are too young, is to comply and provide husbandly rights. But when she becomes pregnant and she doesn't want to carry another pregnant to term, abortion rates went up. Induced abortion became a very commonplace. And the result of it is that a lot of women get infertile from it because it is a back alley abortion. It's not clinical. So women puncture themselves, women ingest things, and this has consequences for their fertility. So in a sense, the fertility rates have evened themselves out. The mortality rates are high, the fertility rates, the birth rates are high. So the population has not increased that much in the war in Southern Sudan. The only, if there is ever anything positive about the war, the only thing that could be seen as positive by the war is that it has insulated the country during the war from in and out movement of people, and therefore the rates of HIV are very low. So you could have seen that the situation would have been much, much worse if, under this context where the woman no longer has the right of decision-making power over her body, HIV rates would have gone up a great deal, but they are low. I mean, depending on the sporadic tests that have been done, of course. There have been no any universal testing done throughout the country. The movement of people into refugee camps and not having work to do, it's like having an earthquake for a month, and the following 9 months you have a lot of death because people are not working and simply are staying in their huts. And so birth rates go up in refugee camps very much. Not only because they want to replenish their population, but also just because they have all the time they need for sex. Yes.
Khartoum has grown very, very large. I think a lot of people, some of them are brought there against their will, but a lot of them go there because there's not too many other places to.
Yes, during the height of the war, yes, a lot of people have been displaced from Darfur, from Southern Sudan, the outskirts of Khartoum, all these shanty towns, Mashhum, all around Khartoum. Over 4 million people from the peripheries have moved to Khartoum. So in terms of area and population, the number has gone up drastically over the last 25 years, which also contributes to the fear of the ruling Arab class that the face of the country, the face of the capital has been Africanized. And it causes them to explain a whole lot to the visiting Arabs. Why do you claim yourself to be an Arab country when the entire capital city is made up of people who are black? Of course, what they don't understand is that the racial nomenclature in Sudan is different from the way it is used everywhere else. You can be black as charcoal, and you can still call yourself an Arab, and nothing we can do about it, because identity is what people want. People, I am who I think I am. I'm not who I think other people think I ought to be. So that has complicated the politics, especially that is why the government does not like elections, because they know if they register all these voters, they're definitely going to lose elections. But the city itself, as Sudan become, I mean, this is something that is so absurd. Sudan is a middle-income country now because of all the money that is coming from the oil. And there are all these investments from the Arab world. Gaddafi building hotels, the Sheikh of Oman, all this oil money is being invested a great deal in Sudan. So the Khartoum, the capital city itself, no longer look like it's a capital city of the Sudan that has Darfur in it, because it's just such a stark difference between the capital city and all the other peripheries, especially the northeast, the Red Sea area. Nowadays, it's even worse than Darfur in terms of, because the rain has not come for years in a row, and they are normally they rely on cattle herding and on small farms, but even that is no more. And the Sudan government continues to believe that until those peripheries have given up their fight, in fact, it becomes perfect for the government to say, to have absolutely feel no responsibility towards the peripheries. And there are many countries in Africa like that, that may be called countries of the capital city. They are only countries in the city because the government actually put money in the hands of this small minority but very powerful support base. All the money is invested in this small group of people. Many of them who executed people in the beginning for gambling, because when the current government came to power, they used to think of investment in stock as gambling, and it is anti-Islam. So they executed people who were engaged in money exchange businesses. They closed them all down. There were no more money exchange, because it was, for them, from the Islamic point of view, it is gambling, because you are counting on the possibility that the rate will go up tomorrow and you sell it again and so forth like that, and you're making profit. But now that is exactly what they are doing, the ones who are in the government, after they have killed everybody.
We've heard that basically the North is fairly unified, and they've been able to do that because of their religion, and it seems that we haven't seen that in the South so much, where we have continuous fractionalization along tribal lines, even to a degree where government from the North has been able to exploit that. What do you think is the prospect of the South building its own identity, especially should the referendum happen and should people vote to separate from the North, so that it actually remains one country?
Well, I mean, Southern Sudan has the ingredients of a nation, of an independent nation, but it has its problems as well. Problems to do with ethnic nationalities. In 1991, the SPLA, the movement that got Southern Sudan this degree of freedom that it has now, split along tribal lines, the Nuer and the Dinka, the biggest tribal groups in Southern Sudan, and they've killed so many people among themselves. And so those kind of things can happen again. And so the current government is busy working on what they call South-South dialogue. So different tribal groups that are feeling are not represented well in the government are being increasingly being represented, to make sure that if the situation becomes such that the South become independent, it can only build a nation if there is unity. But if it goes back to war, it needs to go back to war as a unified territory, without factionalization within the South, which then could be used by the government against them. So indeed, it is a delicate balance that the government would have to do.
Thank you for coming to Princeton, by the way. In your writings, you wrote that one of the ways to bring liberation to the people was to end slavery in the North and the South. You seem to be a proponent talking about slavery. I'd like you to expand a little bit more on that. Is it to give them a sense of dignity? Why do you see that, not economic or humanitarian aid, but so much?
You mean the idea of paying for freedom of slaves?
Exactly.
Well, it is really it's a delicate issue. To pay for the freedom of slaves and take them back is to simply give the slaver business, is to create a situation where they might go back and abduct more so that you can buy them back. So logistically, I mean, economically, it makes sense that you shouldn't pay for slaves. But to keep them, to not do this with an eye to pushing for the ending of the practice to begin with, might take years and years while the slaves rot in bondage. So what do? You buy slaves and you create a situation where you might be feeding the slavery, or you push for the ending of this slave abduction once and for all, which might take 10 years. It's a very difficult one. I mean, but this is something that goes back to the efforts to end slavery in 19th century. And any slave would definitely be happy to get their freedom if somebody paid for them. So the reason why I push for it is that actually it was the people whose family members had been in bondage that started the process. and they were selling their cows, and they were going all over the place looking for these people through middlemen. And when they find them, they would offer the captor some material reward in exchange for the release of this person. So the people in the Dinka areas and the Nuer and the Nuba were doing this on their own. And it was this that the certain groups in the international community, like Christian Solidarity International, which when they discovered it, they supported it. And instead of Dinka people selling their cows to go, they would come to them and say, okay, we can give you money to go and release if you can find them. So while it does not heal the problem from its roots, it makes a difference in the life of one or two children who have been brought out of slavery, I think.
Between the slaves that are kept free after once being bought back and those that are captured again?
We have had no evidence that that the purchase of slaves has increased the rate of raiding. It doesn't seem like people are selling their slaves only to come back tomorrow and abduct more so they can sell them back to you. This doesn't seem to have happened. So there is no empirical evidence that buying slaves actually increases slavery. From a logical economic point of view, of course, it looks like it would do. But empirically, it has not been evident. But if you are, the issue is that a lot of human rights groups like Human Rights Watch say that freedom is inherently natural possession. You shouldn't have to pay for it. Everybody should be freed without being paid for it. And of course, this is a moral high ground that does not necessarily put into a consideration that while we are pushing, of course, we all want the slavery to end at the end of the day. But when might it come? And in the meantime, it seems like if that was the logic, the Allied forces would have probably not come to the rescue of the Jews under the Nazi Holocaust, because some people were saying we should wait until the war is over. But waiting until the war is over, it doesn't take long before you have victimized a person so badly, or killed them even. So I think it is important to continue to pay for as many slaves as you can while you're working for the ending of the practice as a whole.